you have to do something limiting and damaging to the upper classes in favor of the lower classes, in certain senses. Now, we might look a little bit closer into that because it is just a bit Marxist. It sounds just a bit class warfare-ish. So we might look into it just a bit more. But the fact that tyrants arose and were part of the upper classes and then curtailed the privileges of the upper classes is actually a pretty good testament against Marxist tripe and shit. Because why would the upper classes ever do something to help the lower classes? Why would they ever harm their class? I thought that was class warfare. Maybe Marx didn't know about Greece. So he tended to curtail privileges of his peers, while his position rested upon force, exhibited in a standing bodyguard. Such a leader needed popular support. Tyrants accordingly favored the peasants by dividing up big estates, and by other means. Also, they often aided the growth of the newly rising industrial and commercial classes. Camouflage for their position could be gained by emphasizing patriotic festivals, building temples, and favoring poets and artists. So they did what was done later in the Renaissance a lot. Great writers and painters and stuff were patronized by kings and princes, and this was done by tyrants. Most tyrants preferred not to take the hazards of war against their neighbors, although they might have gained their initial renown as generals, but they were not averse to colonial expansion. So they weren't necessarily in there for military reasons. Among the more famous and lasting houses of tyrants were three: that of Orthaerogus and Cleisthenes at Sicyon, 655 to 570. And we'll skip a bit, it's details, it's fine. Cypselus, Cypselus, and Periander at Corinth, 620 to 550. And that of Pisistratus and his sons at Athens, 546 to 510, which is discussed in chapter 12. We might get some of that. In these examples, tyranny lasted more than one generation, but in most cases, more stable and constitutional governments had been resumed by the 6th century. And we go talk about Greek expansion overseas. This is a bit about colonization. We're going to do some about colonization here, and we're also going to get, as I mentioned earlier from Botsford, quite a bit about colonization, some good stuff in there. The Mediterranean in the 8th century, in the 700s. Although city-states had been known in earlier Mesopotamia and existed in the 8th century along the coasts of Syria and Phoenicia, the Greek development seems to have been purely local. The spread of the Greeks abroad, which now began to take place by sea, was likewise primarily a reflection of the tremendous energies that had been built up in the Aegean world. But its remarkable speed was much facilitated by the growing unity of the Mediterranean world at this time. In the Near East, trade and culture were being consolidated in a broad plain, which was soon reflected in the Assyrian political unification of the region. The Phoenicians had begun to trade in the western Mediterranean, where considerable progress had already occurred in the early 1st millennium BC, and a mysterious people called the Etruscans were importing Eastern civilization into Italy. Both to the east and to the west, venturesome Greeks found the paths of the sea more open than ever before. As in Mycenaean times, the Greeks were deeply attracted eastward to the center of civilization. Here, however, the political and economic structure was so developed that they came in the role as traders, not conquerors. Now I've mentioned, I'm not sure if it was in this video series, I don't think so, that whenever two civilizations meet, it is always the more sophisticated one that becomes dominant. The less sophisticated one adapts and adopts things from the more sophisticated one. That's a rule throughout history. So when the early Greek peoples met the East, they absorbed and adopted from the East. A trading post at Elmina by the mouth of the Orontes River in Syria has recently been excavated and attests that Greek merchants, primarily from the Aegean Islands, but also from Corinth, Rhodes, and elsewhere, were settled there by the early 8th century. At this and similar points, the Greeks became acquainted with the polished products of Near Eastern workshops and also picked up such ideas as the alphabet. So this is as the Dark Age ends, as trade and colonization are picking up, they begin to important things like the alphabet. The Eastern connection grew steadily after 700 down to the time when Alexander the Great conquered the Near East. The first contacts with which we are here alone concerned were mainly with Syria and proceeded chiefly by the Great Sea Road below the south coast of Asia Minor. In Pamphylia and Cilicia, local conditions were still sufficiently primitive so that the Greeks could occasionally settle. But even in Cyprus, where Greek-speaking peoples had secured a foothold at the end of the Mycenaean era, they did not gain cultural dominion until the 6th century and later. Trade with Egypt began later than with Syria and was restricted by the pharaohs of the 26th dynasty to selected ports, such as the new settlement of Naucratis about 610 BC. From this time on, Greek traders and learned men such as Solon and Herodotus were to be deeply impressed by the antique wisdom and monuments of the land of the Nile. Right? Those pyramids are something else. I haven't seen them myself, but what they must have been, even to Aristotle. Do you know Aristotle is closer to us in time than he was to the building of the Great Pyramids? Almost exactly halfway between. Mycenaean traders had reached the coasts of Italy and Sicily, and so too did Greeks from the 8th century onward. Here they came, first, to sell their own wares of luxuries in Near Eastern origin. In return they gained slaves, and above all metals, to supply the growing industries of the Aegean world. Almost immediately the Greeks discovered that they could dominate these western shores, and a great wave of colonization ensued. So they were sort of grasping at an opportunity while they had energy and productivity. Now it occurs to me, it says they were importing metals from the western Mediterranean. They also imported metal from the east, from Asia Minor and from Syria. So it seems to me they just imported a lot of metal, didn't they? They were productive, voracious people. Quote, neither the precise causes of this colonization nor its methods of operation are easily ascertainable in lack of contemporary literary evidence. During the confusion at the end of the Mycenaean age, some Greeks had moved across the Aegean Islands to the coast of Asia Minor, but throughout the Dark Ages the Hellenic world did not have the energy for further expansion. By the 8th century, however, Greek civilization and society were advancing rapidly, and there clearly seems to have been a surplus of discontented population in the homeland. Since this surplus came largely from the countryside, the sites for Greek colonies were chosen mainly with an eye to agricultural possibilities. Obviously, 97% of people make their living from agriculture. That's what they would have to choose it by. But settlers also sought easily defensible hills or promontories close to the sea for their main settlement. Good harbors, interestingly enough, were not always selected. Interesting, but obvious, because if you are in a good harbor and you don't have a fantastic defense, then an army can just row right up into your good little harbor and land. So, among the many home states, only a relatively few along the coasts served as focuses for the great wave of colonization. Athens founded no colonies. Neither did the Boeotian cities. Both areas probably had enough farmland for their growing population. It mentioned Athens was 1,000 square miles. Both, moreover, seem to have fallen culturally into a backwater in the Age of Revolution. Now, the Age of Revolution is the ending of the Dark Age. As the city-state's getting set up, as we get ready to begin the Golden Age, Athens was a bit of a backwater. There were other more important cities, that's true. So Athens sent out no colonies. Sparta